part one is concentrating on broad media. I'll explain what that is. Okay, I'm going to have to, because this is really small, it's on my knee. But drawing media falls into three distinct categories. We've got liquid medium, which is the next talk, which is on ink, and that's commonly applied with brushes or pens. Then we have metal point, and then broad media, which is natural and fabricated chalks or pastels, charcoal, graphite, and crayons. And each of these have their own unique characteristics which can significantly enhance and shape the meaning and expression of your work. So subtle as they may be, but they are quite different from one another. So in this order, we're going to look at metal points, which is the oldest, or one of the oldest known approaches to drawing, then into natural chalks, fabricated chalks, crayons and pencils, charcoal and graphite. We'll start with metal points. I've got a couple of metal points here which I did eons ago. One which is you might want to pass them around. One which is on a ground of zinc oxide, and the other which is pulverized eggshells. But it shows you the kind of mark, because you might not have seen silver point. Has anybody seen a silver point at close range? Yep, yeah. So they're quite subtle. So these were commonly practiced, particularly in the Renaissance period, but they start really in the late Middle Ages. And it involves two major components, a ground, which is slightly abrasive, and that can be applied to paper or parchment or board, and then the metal stylus, which creates the mark. So very popular during the 15th and 16th centuries, and obviously the Italians perfected the technique. So if you look at the prepared ground to begin with, a number of materials were used to coat the paper or the support. Anything from pulverized or burnt horned stag, or fowls and thigh bones of chicken, and gelded lambs. These are ancient recipes that are listed in Cennini's thesis. But mainly the active ingredient for these is calcium phosphate. And then you have egg or seashells, and they're soaked in vinegar before they're calcined, which is heated to a high temperature, and then they're pulverized. And that's basically calcium carbonate, as indeed is chalk dust. But lead white, obviously you're probably familiar with that as a pigment. And then later on, revival techniques in the late 19th, early 20th century, because it did come back to some degree during that period. They used zinc and titanium grounds, which are basically aqueous paints from a tube. Now, many of the old grounds were tinted pale colours, largely tones of pink, green and blue, but there's many other tones as well, but they're the common ones. The binders. Again, there's a number of binders that are listed in treatises. The most common one is a glue size, which is made from gelatin or parchment clippings, and normally it was about 1 ounce to 25 ounces of water. Gum arabic is another common one, and occasionally you'll find recipes for linseed oil as well, which is more akin to the kind of grounds that you would have on your canvas. Now, zinc and titanium, if that's used, you would use 3 binder to 2 pigment, or 2 ratios. bone and shell 6, 65, and linseed oil and lead white is just mixed to a viscous paste and then spread across the surface. And the treaties, I mean, they do vary how many coats are recommended, and it depends on the type of material that you're using. Some carbonates can be very transparent, so you need extra layers, and you may even sand between the layers, a bit like gesso. So up to 9 coats can be applied. And you can also finish that off with a slight burnishing, which we discussed in earlier lectures. Now, problems with the grounds, you have to be careful, and with bone dust and eggshells if you are tempted to use this technique, because it can be quite horny and rough if you don't pulverize the material enough, and then you'll have to use more burnishing techniques, and if you go too far with the burnishing techniques, then the metal stylus will fail to make a mark. So you've got to be careful how far you go with the burnishing. You need a slight tooth with the ground. Now the styluses, again, a number of materials are listed in the treatises. Silver, and that's the ones going around made from silver. Lead is very common, gold, copper, tin, and then alloys of brass and bronze. Now when they're all applied, they all look very similar, grey basically, but later, and it can happen quite quickly, they can oxidize, and it depends what conditions they're kept in. If it's in a city environment, oxidation is likely to occur much quicker. But they do change subtly in colour, depending on what metal form they are. Now the silver ones, which is silver sulfide, they can go slightly browner and much lighter in hue as they oxidize. Copper forms, which is basic copper carbonate. You might all be aware of how copper corrodes. It goes a green colour, yellowish green colour, and that generally lightens in colour value too. So there are papers that suggest that oxidation can take as little as 2 years if it was framed, and quite quickly, within months or weeks, in polluted environments. Now, the characteristics of metal point, basically it's a very light medium in that it doesn't produce great tonal ranges, and it has a very even texture as well. So it's not possible to make a black mark at all with metal point, regardless of what metal it is. And even if you increase the pressure, you're likely to go through the paper as opposed to increasing that intensity. To make broader marks, because normally they're just set in, jewelers often make these things. I don't have, I would have bought one if I had one, but I know when I worked with the drawing technique, a jeweler set into a wooden handle a metal stylus, and you can have on either end of the wooden block different sizes, so you can increase the thickness. So if you wanted to make a broader, blunter mark, then you would increase the size of the stylus rather than your mark making capacity. It is a very fine technique, and you build up shaded areas with hatching and cross hatching and even stippling rather than pressure. Some of the styluses, some of the metals also become more transparent with age, and that adds to the delicacy of the technique, and especially if they're applied to white grounds, that can significantly add to the nuances of the surface. But this technique is really only applicable to small detailed drawings. You wouldn't work on something half the size of this table, otherwise I suppose you could, but it would take an awful long time. So when you see old master drawings, they're normally quite small scale when they're created in this technique. So less, obviously, appropriate for loose sketching and quick, free-flowing and vigorous strokes. So, you know, it's a very delicate and detailed technique. And you also have to be careful once you've created these metal points, if you've attempted in doing so, is that the surface becomes quite fragile. And certainly in conservation we have a great deal of problems with the surface or the ground as opposed to the marks made by the stylus. Because they easily become blemished and they compact down and become shiny, so they bruise easily too. This is a classic example of a silver point on a lead white prepared ground by Leonardo da Vinci. I'm sure you're all familiar with that interesting image. A lot of the marks around the edge are obviously from aging and oxidation of the lead white. And that's another one by Lippi from about 1490. And this is metal point, it's not stipulated, but again on a lead white ground, which is tinted grey. Quite delicate. A lot of these were also highlighted in chalk and perhaps strengthened in inks, which we'll be talking about next time. But this is typical, that white chalk with the metal point. So that's an interesting technique which you might be tempted to try in a modern idiom. But now we'll look at chalks, pastels and crayons, which you're probably more familiar with. Have you all worked in this kind of medium before? Yeah. So in historical literature, the terms for chalks and pastels and crayons are often interchangeable, so it's difficult to decipher exactly what they're talking about sometimes. So it does make interpretation quite difficult. For example, the word crayon in both English and French treatises can refer to anything from, you know, a fatty binder or graphite pencil or even a pastel, so it's quite ambiguous. And rarely do any of the early writings make a distinction between natural and fabricated chalks and indeed charcoal. So it is quite difficult to unpick. But if you're looking at these objects quite a lot, which obviously in my career had access to this sort of thing, then you do build up a significant knowledge about the differences and nuances. We also have the microscopes to help us too. So if you first look at natural chalks, which is certainly the earliest form, obviously prehistoric man was drawing with natural chalks, which are mineral substances which have been kind of fashioned from just rocks really, and they were chiselled into small manageable sticks and didn't need any further processing at all. So the white, which is ubiquitous throughout the centuries, I mean we still use it today. You might be able to get it from even an ordinary art shop, is from natural deposits of chalk, of which proliferate throughout Europe and even in the UK. And that's basically calcium carbonate. Or you might go to form which is silicate of magnesium, which is tailor's chalk, which are used in fabric, clothes construction. They're very friable in texture, and they don't have a huge amount of covering power when you compare them with pastels or fabricated chalks. But as I say, they were and still are used extensively for highlighting drawings and watercolours, throughout the ages. Black, which you'll rarely see now, natural black chalk, is from a carbonaceous shale. So again, they're wide deposits throughout Europe and beyond. And they produce very neat linear drawings, and they're not quite so dusty and friable, the lines that are made from black chalk, when you compare it with charcoal or fabricated. They are a little bit lacking in chromatic intensity when you compare it with pastels, for instance. And then the interesting one is red chalk, or sanguine. And this is formed from red earths, which are rich in iron oxides, and they're available in all sorts of tones at the period, from quite bright orangey red through to tan and brown. So if we look at the sanguine more closely, because it is an important drawing material, particularly during the 15th and 18th century, and often combined in conjunction with mid-tone coloured papers, and they could be, I'm not talking about grounds now, but coloured papers that were made from coloured rags, like blue, from indigo, and even colours or natural dyes that were added to the paper. There was a number of those available, particularly during the 18th century from artist colourmen and various other suppliers. So sanguine, actually, or red chalk, natural red chalk, lends itself perfectly to smudging and rubbing techniques. And they used to use either their fingers, of course, or quite commonly a rag, which was screwed up into a tight, almost like a dolly, used for printmaking. And you could lift out or smudge around the paper to force it into the interstices of the support. And then you can draw almost, once you've got a kind of smooth this area of this big chalk, and you can draw into it with an eraser to pick out the highlights. And that was commonly done during this early period. For added depth, because it doesn't have enormous chromatic intensity, it could be mixed with, so they powder it down or grate it down, and then mix it with a little bit of gum water, which is usually gum arabic, although other gums, like cherry, could be used too. And that, and then they would apply it perhaps with a brush, or form it into a stick, and then you would get much more of a rich velvety dark from that technique. And red chalk, or sanguine, actually is quite good because it stands a lot of redrawing and corrections without needing a lot of fixing. You know what fabricated chalks might be like. They're very friable and easy to offset. But sanguine is less so. So, according to the literature and looking at samples, sanguine lends itself very naturally to sketches and still life studies. It's particularly good for modelling and suggesting volume and rendering the human flesh. This is a typical example of the use of black chalk in this case, and white chalk. And this is on blue paper. And although you can't see it very clearly, that there is some kind of framing with a brown ink line, which we'll discuss next time. Also, he worked a lot in pastel. And this is a combination, and the combination of black, red and white is particularly important to his work on these quite brown, rich tinted papers. But he's using the chalk in a very loose way in areas and then quite broad in regards to the white. It's got a lovely quality about it. So that's natural chalks, which you unlikely perhaps to come across other than the white, but the fabricated chalks and pastels, which are readily available now in artist shops, are entirely different, although they might look similar. They were introduced in the 17th century and basically made from pastes, which were the dry pigment, and it could be any standard pigment that's used for painting. And then you add it to a soluble binding medium, and then it's rolled up into a stick and dried. Sometimes they increase the drying by heating, but basically it's just, you know, a glue binder with dry pigment and then drying. And obviously the pigments come from all different sources, so they're not natural earths like the natural chalks. Now, a range of vast range of colours were available even from this early period, and you would get artists going into an artist colourman and ordering a range that was particularly suited to their work, and they were even called, like, you know, Watto's range or whatever. So they would have very specific tints and hues made up. So you can mix any pigments together to form innumerable hues. And if you add white to it, which is mainly a natural earth, particularly tobacco clay pipe, is added to create huge range of tints as well. So enormous range of colours could be you know, made at the time, and still are. The pure white, though, was never made just from chalk or tobacco clay pipe. It was normally lead white, although you won't find that today because it's so poisonous. Now the binding medium, really interesting. You could write a whole dissertation on this. In various treatises, they even use things like, unlikely things like rotten ale, and spit and all sorts of things, and eye of newt. But certainly there was a whole range of quite weird organic material that was used in the early days to bind these things together. Today it's methyl cellulose, which my students will know a lot about, which is a cellulose derivative. But right through most of the 18th and 19th century, gum tragacanth, which is quite similar to gum arabic but less soluble, was the main component, and particularly if it was made commercially. So if you increase the binder, you get a much harder material, and that's much better suited to neat and precise drawings. Whereas if you pull back on the amount of binding material, it becomes more softer, more friable, and that's more suited to broad techniques and stump work. You've got to be careful with, if you're using fabricated chalks or pastels, when you're framing them, never frame them under perspex, otherwise you'll end up through static with half the image on the underside of the perspex. Did you all know that? Yeah, good. And it will often need spraying with a fixative, and that's another horror that conservators have to deal with as well, because most of the fixatives discolour. They're made from organic resins which discolour very readily with light. Never use hairspray. I used to use hairspray. Has anybody used hairspray? Yeah. Yeah. I should have brought something in that I'd done. And that really discolours, Smells nice though. So the characteristics of fabricated chalks are you know, quite different from natural chalks. They tend, even with the slightest pressure, they'll disintegrate readily into the paper surface. They also saturate the support more so than natural chalks, and leave mounds of pigment particles on the paper grain. So, you know, if you're using quite a distinct grain paper, like a rough paper, you'll get on the tops of the crest more pigment resting there, which again gives that line a much more kind of lively appearance. Yeah, so, you know, they have very different qualities really from natural chalks. And particularly suited, if you're using them singularly, they're particularly suited to, you know, large-scale drawings and broad strokes and broad modelling. Now, fabricated chalks gave rise, certainly in the 18th century, to a very fashionable technique called smudging and stumping, which is massing and blending half-tones really, so you don't have any distinct edges or lines. It's not linear in any shape or form. But this proliferated through the 18th and 19th century. And it involves layering one upon the other, either colour, it's usually colour, chalk, to build up your design. And this is fixed, one layer upon the other, because if you put friable chalk or pastel over another layer of friable chalk, it blends too much, and you don't get that drawing effect that you might want. You may want a blended effect, but if you're building up a design or shape, then you might want to fix it. And this replaced this smudging and stumping technique. More intuitive line and hatch techniques which the old master used. But it was very important during the 18th century for portraits, and they're often called pastel portrait paintings as opposed to drawings. And obviously later on in the 19th century, Degas and Lautrec and Mary Cassatt used them to great degree. Smudging and stumping was the antithesis of early 20th century, particularly British artists and those from the Slade School of Art, because they argue very strongly, Tonks and even Le Gros earlier, slightly earlier, argue that it just didn't produce a drawing that of corporeal mass, so it didn't give the feeling of space and depth like a line drawing and the hatching does from
peculiar argument, isn't it, Jane?
Sorry?
Pretty peculiar argument.
It is, but Tonks, waxed lyrical about that, and it was very popular at the time. It does actually, if you study the drawings, linear drawings, we'll see some in a minute, they don't have that dynamic feeling of space. Would you agree? Line drawing as opposed to smudging. Let me show you.
Sorry, I've interrupted the flow there. We carry on.
Yeah.
We do get to something quite interesting to see. Because
Okay. So not only this fashion for pastel painting arose and smudging and stumping, there was also a range of specialised papers produced to coincide with this new technique. A lot of them were made with slight texture, and you'll find wool often added to the the fibres to give it that slight texture. And even things like marble and wood dust or pumice bound in glue and added to either the size or as a kind of almost like a coating. And ombre papers, which are still produced by French companies today, introduced a whole range of slightly coloured, nice muted colours. You've probably seen them quite commonly in artist shops. But this was in reaction to this fashionable technique. So this is a later version, obviously Mary Cassatt, which is used not only grated pastel to build up the design, but which is applied with a stump. I don't know whether you know what the stump is, but you can buy them. They're like compressed rolls of paper in a pencil format, and you grate your pastel and your colours together and apply it with a stump. So she's applied it largely with that, and then the more aggressive marks are applied with the pastel directly on top. But this would have been fixed, to build up those layers with a concoction of resins, which at this period would be administered with a mouth diffuser, like a metal. Don't know, has anybody seen those? You still buy them. You stick one in the liquid and one you blow, and the nozzle sprays a fine deposit on your chalk. And this is an example of fixative problems. This is Charles Sims' study for Spring Song. And also a return, the early 20th century, to those kind of linear way of drawing, which is, you would think that was from the 16th century, perhaps. But this is early 20th century. But he has fixed, and you can see that yellow deposit in the middle. That's from the effects of fixative discolouring. But he's using linear and hatch marks. So it wasn't just the Slade, it did rub off to a number of artists during the period. Johns wrote lots about it as well. He hated stumping. Prefer this style of drawing. Conte, which I'm sure most of you have heard of as well, is also a fabricated chalk, and perhaps more commonly known as sanguine, although you can get it in white and browns and even blacks. And it was introduced by Conti in the early 19th century. He was the inventor of the modern graphite pencil. And it was during the Napoleonic Wars that the best graphite, which was really from, ignore that. I'm talking about graphite pencils and out of context. But it is, this Conti or sanguine is distinguished from other regular fabricated chalks by its distinct shape. So they're not cylindrical, they tend to be square when you buy them in the shops. And they don't have as much friability usually, so you can produce more precision drawing with them. They're much more akin to the natural red chalks of earlier period. And they're quite chromatically strong as well. They have a very high content of iron oxide in them. But it lacks the kind of tonal values of natural chalk generally. More suited again to smaller scale work. This is Charles Sims. I keep showing Charles Sims. Charles Sims is a fairly important figure in that we have a collection of his works in Burt Hall of original drawings. He was a Royal Academician, very famous in his day, and also an inspired teacher at the Royal Academy, and trustee of the Tate Gallery for about 10 years. So an important Edwardian early 20th century artist whose work ranged from quite traditional high Victorian through to almost modernist approaches before he committed suicide. But this is one of his delicate drawings using red Conti chalk. It's quite small scale. It's a study for one of his well-known paintings that's in the Durban City Art Gallery in South Africa. Right, crayons and pencils. Lots of problems with trying to identify the term crayon as well. But they're essentially coloured sticks, as I'm sure you're aware of, and that they are made from either oily or waxy, greasy binding medium, and even a combination of water-soluble or fatty binders. So there's a whole range of materials can be used to bind the pigments. The aim was obviously to make them less friable than pastels and saturate the colour more. Historically, they appeared in rather a sporadic manner. And there's no logical pattern that I've been able to find in their development. And again, a wide range of weird binding material was used to hold the pigments in order to make these quite waxy, oily sticks to draw with. And anything from spermaceti, which is the white wax from sperm whales, tallow, soaps, shellac and wax and linseed oil was all used to bind the pigments together. Then they were fashioned into sticks. And they were first produced, however, commercially by Staedtler in 1835. So before that it was rather sporadic. And when Staedtler brought them out for the first time, they had very few colours, tried and tested colours, things like Prussian blue, chrome yellow, chrome green. And these were pigments dispersed in a clay and then baked quite hard, and then fashioned into a stick, or a round, or forced into a wooden stick. So that sort of carried on through the 19th century. And then in the 1920s there was a huge development in reaction to schools using them mainly, and the company Rowney, which supplied the schools during the late 19th and certainly early 20th century, even set up new factories to make crayons of this time. So they became very common. Now there's only a few known examples from the 18th century. Fragonard, for instance, used to use coloured crayons. But during the 19th century they became very popular, and the works of Lautrec are probably the most common. He also used a black crayon or a lithographic crayon, that you do lithographic printing. It's quite common to use that on paper. Sims used to use it too. Generally, crayons are more serviceable for linear work. They don't tend to lend themselves to smudging, and they lack the friability to make them terribly useful for sort of broad blending toning, subtle gradations. So they have their limitations there. But they do, however, have chromatic intensity, quite unlike a lot of the other broad media. Today they're available in all sorts of viscosities. You can go to any shop and buy a coloured crayon, and there are different softnesses and hardnesses. And that's all to do with the amount of binding material, usually. This is a photomicrograph of coloured blue pencil drawing at 40 times magnification, and you can see the lines are quite controlled. You don't get any fracturing beyond the line, and often you get a concentration of the media in the middle as well, which enhances a certain quality with the rock. Chocolate. It's described, obviously, as quite a modest material. And it's tended to be overlooked because it's so common these days, but it was so important to artists, particularly during the 18th and 19th centuries, and even today. Who uses charcoal today? At the beginning of the 19th century, charcoal replaced the hard natural chalks as a principal medium really for figure studies, particularly in the academies, those in France and in the UK. So commonly used for live drawing classes, and I would imagine across the country now most people will draw in charcoal when they're doing live studies. It was also commonly used to transfer cartoons or sketches onto a canvas in preparation for painting. It has many degrees of hardnesses and softnesses, and the best, certainly historically, were the Venetian or vine charcoals. And they're created by burning sticks of wood. You've probably seen these before. Things like this are often featured in documentaries on the television. And willow or linden is the common wood to use. You can also buy it in powdered form, or powder it yourself, obviously by grating and pummeling. And this was often used to tone, large sections of the drawing. And then you've got the compressed charcoal, which I bet most of you are working with, those who do work with it, which is the charcoal powder mixed with a gum binder. And this is compressed then into either the round sticks or square broader sticks. And the amount of binder that they add increases or decreases the hardness. But I suspect most of you will be using compressed. So charcoal is particularly suited to line and mass drawing techniques, and you can sharpen it into a point to make quite decisive marks. And if you use it broadside, you can use it almost like a paintbrush. It is probably the nearest thing to painting in broad, medium drawing techniques. When rubbed with the finger, it sheds a soft grey tone over the whole work, and then highlights can be picked out very easily with an eraser, almost with the precision of drawing with white chalk. It doesn't have enormous covering power though, and it doesn't have the kind of range of tonalities, and I'm talking about comparing with black chalk. It generally appears grey, brown in lighter areas. So often artists would use, in conjunction with the charcoal, black chalk or fabricated chalks in which to strengthen certain areas of the drawing. But it still produces, quite a good range of light and dark contrasts. And its feathery, soft notes are all to do with how it splinters, because it's very friable, the most friable of all broad material. So you get these fragmented lines. If you look under the microscope more closely, you'll see that fragmentation, which is quite unique. And these are particularly suited to figure and portrait work, as I've said before. This is a cartoon, an old 16th century, which has combined both charcoal and black chalk. And you can clearly see, can't you, in those darker, intense areas, that's the natural black chalk. And then those softer notes are from the charcoal itself. Graphite pencil. Another commonplace instrument and often taken for granted, but it is hugely important. It's an allotrope of carbon, and it was first mined in Borrowdale in Cumbria in 1664, and it was just, honed out of the ground, fashioned into a lump or a stick, and then he used that for drawing and for marking paper. It was not until the 18th century that the true composition of graphite was decided upon either, so quite a bit after. They weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. So 18th century, then it was called graphite, not until. The modern graphite pencil is the discovery of a Frenchman called Conte, who in 1795 took inferior grades of natural graphite from the continent and ground it together with clay, compressed it into a paste, and then baked it at a low temperature, and hey presto, you had a graphite pencil. And he was forced into this technique because of the Napoleonic Wars, which stopped the mining of the graphite, the really good graphite from Borrowdale, which is the best in the world apparently, because it was used for cannonballs. And obviously the trade was disrupted with the war, so they had to find another way of producing graphite pencils with inferior grades. So hence, in times of war, there's a lot of technology that comes out of that. This is one of the early examples. But now, and certainly by the early 20th century, synthetic graphite is made, and this is by passing, I don't know how it works exactly, but electric current through granular anthracite via the Aitchison method. Don't ask me what that is, because I don't know. But, and this now produces the pencils that we use today. It's never been made of lead. I know I was terrified as a child for sucking pencils because my mother used to say I'd get lead poisoning. It has never been made of lead. Did anybody else get told off about that? Sucking pencils? No. Maybe it's just curious to my time. Ong is believed to be one of the first artists to exploit the use of graphite pencil, and he chose subjects that were complementary to the medium and its limited tonal density, because it doesn't have enormous tonal density. And he was very clever about avoiding those undesirable shiny effects which you can get from overworking graphite. But his graphite drawings are very beautiful indeed. Yeah, but it's quite strange. Well, certainly through my research, there was a resistance to use graphite pencil in the academies, particularly in the London art schools, because people, and this is quite accomplished artists, thought that it demanded much higher levels of observational skills and hand-eye coordination and more discipline. So it was less commonly used in regards to drawing, especially life studies in academies, despite its cheapness and availability. So its characteristics are it's comparatively weak, as you probably know, so heavy marks are not particularly possible unless you go to much softer grades, but then you'll never achieve blacks. It does produce subtle effects and great precision, obviously, and it can help with the stippling techniques and kind of smooth sculptural effects which proliferated during the 19th century. This is a typical graphite drawing from English school from mid 19th century, in that the kind of mark making which also harks back to slightly earlier period as well. The foliage there, it's highly stylized, and graphite lends itself to that kind of mark making. This is the type of work that was executed in the academies. This is a scholarship entry. You had to draw like this before you even went into the Royal Academy during the 19th century and early 20th century. So this was a scholarship entry for the Royal Academy, dated 1914-15. Apparently this took 20 sittings, and it took over a year to complete. And it's highly detailed stippled work. I mean, looks like marble itself, doesn't it? But the stipple is very fine if you look at it closely. And it produces this quite smooth sculptural quality. But there was a great deal of resistance to this kind of laboured, stippling work in the early 20th century, particularly from slave professors and members of the avant-garde who preferred much more looser drawings like this, so which were dealing with the mass of the figure. So it's linear, things are outlined, and form is suggested with shading, cross-hatching and hatching, not through scumbling and smudging. It's all linear, and they felt that was much purer, more dynamic, more true, and suggested this corporal form more effectively. So we end up with two studies, one from Michelangelo, study from the Sistine Chapel, and then from the late 20s, which again is Chelsea.